What's going on, guys, and welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham Jason Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. Today we're talking the premiere of Broken Skull Sessions as seen on the WWE Network from right after Survivor Series on Sunday, featuring none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin himself and his very first guest, The Undertaker. So, they have done the Stone Cold podcast before. You're not seeing things, you're not hearing things. They have done the Stone Cold podcast before on the network. 5 years ago, actually, almost to the day that it debuted on the network right after, I think they actually aired the ad for it after Survivor Series 5 years ago, but they didn't premiere it on the network until like December 1st. Because I remember it was like one of those, if you sign up for November, you got to sign up for December, it's this day, it's the first day of December, whatever. And it was a great podcast that Stone Cold sat down and did with Vince McMahon. Now, I've done a few different reviews, I think, maybe only one, of the Stone Cold podcast here on Network and Chill, because I started doing this show right after they stopped doing the podcasts on the network. The last one was with Dean Ambrose. I probably reviewed that one. I remember watching it, reviewing it, because it was awkward the first time. It was awkward when I watched it back and many months later. So yeah, I remember reviewing that one. I think I watched and reviewed the AJ Styles one too, from the summer of 2016. But they did a whole bunch of other ones, too. I think they did around 12. They did one with Paige, which was really disappointing. The Triple H one and the Vince one were probably the highlights. Those were the most newsworthy, the most groundbreaking, I guess you could say. They did a few others with, who else? I don't even remember. They did one with Big Show, Shawn Michaels, I remember, Ric Flair, I want to say, and definitely a few others. John Cena sat down with Jericho, and so did Stephanie. I want to say that Stone Cold was going to do one with Mick Foley. Not Mick Foley, I'm sorry, with Shane McMahon. But he couldn't make it, so they had Mick Foley do it instead. I don't remember exactly. But anyway, they discontinued it after that Ambrose one. Now, Austin's side of the story was, our deal ran up. I was only obligated to do X amount of podcasts, which I think was either 10 or 12. Either way, though, that deal very well could have been renewed for another season of the show. They just didn't do it because of how poor that Ambrose one was. That Ambrose one sucked. So much so that even Austin and Moxley have talked about it in the months since. When Moxley first left WWE earlier this year, he was asked by Wade Keller or Jericho or something in one of the many interviews that he did after he left WWE and he showed up in AEW, and they asked him, what was up with that Stone Cold interview? And he revealed that, it was the producers who wanted Steve to ask these questions, even though I didn't really want to go into my background, didn't really want to go into my childhood, and it created this really awkward atmosphere between Ambrose and Stone Cold. I don't think Moxley's been back on his podcast since, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think he wanted to have him back on. Well, it won't happen now on the network. We know that for sure. But anyway, long story short, they brought back the podcast in the form of Broken Skull Sessions. I had read somewhere this was taped backstage at Madison Square Garden when Raw and SmackDown went there back in early September. It's not at, Austin's house. It's not, at 316 Gimmick Street, which would have been cool, which I think is where he records most of his podcasts. But it was backstage at a WWE show, I believe. The set looked cool. This was taped, of course, from 2 months ago. So it wasn't live. I do miss that live aspect of the podcasts just because anything flies. And who knows? I mean, I'm sure everything was fine for the most part. If there was anything they cut out from this podcast, I would love to know. Like, I know it was, not that it was scripted, but it was taped, and there might have been certain things that they said that they had to cut out. Who knows? You never know. I doubt that was the case, but I really enjoy when the podcasts are live and anything flies. Because when it's edited and it's taped, they might have taken some stuff out. Who knows? Or maybe they talk shit about Vince, they told a bad story about Vince. Who the fuck knows? I doubt it, but you never know. So other than that, though, I thought overall this was great. Especially since they had first revealed in some sort of a press release about around 4 years ago when Stone Cold was doing the podcast for the WWE Network. I think right after he did the Paul Heyman one, which was really good too. He did one with Brock, which was great. Like I said, I think I reviewed that here on Network and Chill a few years ago. It was maybe. If not, then I definitely have to because it was great. But yeah, they put out a press release back in 2015 saying that, hey, we're going to do 3 podcasts with Steve Austin on his podcast on the network, were going to do The Undertaker, Sting, and Hulk Hogan were the top 3. None of those podcasts ever came to fruition. Sting, I think, later sat down with JBL on Legends with JBL, maybe about a year or 2 later. I want to say in 2016, if not early 2017, but probably somewhere in mid-2016. And it was a really good interview, but it wasn't the type of interview that you would get with him and Steve Austin. But it was good, so we ended up kind of getting that, not with him and Stone Cold, but it was still solid on the network. He ended up having a podcast with Hulk Hogan earlier this year, and there was a lot of shit they didn't cover. It was good, but kind of disappointing because there was a lot of stuff they kind of glossed over, but it was still solid. This Taker one has been the one I've been waiting for a long time now. Even Steve has brought it up on his own podcast, on Podcast 1, about how he's really wanted to sit down with Taker for a while now, and Taker even said, yeah, I'll do it, but they just got to find the time, and it never really came to fruition until now. This was great. There were a few things, a lot of things actually, they did not cover. I don't think they ever once mentioned Kane. And Kane is one of the biggest parts of Undertaker's career. And they never mentioned him once. And this was an hour and a half. This lasted for an hour and 40 minutes. About an hour and 38 minutes to be specific. And it was great stuff. The time flew by. But I really wish they would do either a second podcast or a second part. They wrapped this up. They never teased the second part. But I really hope we do get that at some point, because there was a lot of stuff they didn't cover, because they spent a lot of time on some shit, I'm going to be honest with you, people will not give 2 shits about. When Taker's talking about Buzz Sawyer and how he kind of started in the business with him, there's a lot of people that are not going to care about that. I thought it was interesting stuff. He told a lot of fun stories. It was cool, regardless of what Taker is talking about, whether it's Buzz Sawyer or the streak ending or whatever, or whether it's what he ate for fucking breakfast this morning. I find it fascinating because we never see Taker in this type of environment. It has been years since we have seen Taker do this sort of, sit-down interview where he's completely out of character. And I think he did one with some, religious person, some religious icon, maybe about a year or so ago. And then he did, maybe Colin Cowherd, I want to say. Maybe not him or someone else a long time ago. And, I feel like it was for ESPN in 02, 01 maybe. And they were pretty good interviews, but other than that, we have really not seen Taker out of character outside of network specials and DVDs and shit on this, in this type of a setting, which is why I really enjoyed this podcast. So hopefully the next time, they talked a lot about his early beginnings, not so much about his childhood per se, but more so about his first couple of years in the business, his WCW days. Some really fascinating stuff I never knew. Probably a lot of stuff people never knew. But again, I wish maybe next time they would cut a little bit of that out and talk more about... I'll get to the streak stuff later, but Kane. They talked more about his recent stuff, which was good. I appreciated that. They kind of glossed over the Goldberg match from Saudi Arabia Super Showdown earlier this year. But anyway, I thought overall this was really, really good. So I took a long list of notes here, so bear with me. This is it's going to take a while to get through the entire thing. But like I said, about an hour and 40 minutes, the time flew by for me personally. So they started off with Steve asking Undertaker, how do you feel? How do you feel physically currently? And he said he feels good overall. He'll have his bad days, he'll have his good days, but overall, physically, he feels pretty good. Considering the guy's 50-something years old and has been in the business for almost 30 years. That's pretty impressive. They talk about how they've known each other. They've known each other now since 1989, so 30 years, which is crazy, dating back to their time in WCW and other promotions. Taker remembers, Steve asks him, again, they don't really get into his childhood, but they do get into, what drew you into getting into the business? What drew you to professional wrestling? And Taker talks about, remember going down to the Sam Houston Coliseum. He was mesmerized shaking Andre the Giant's hand. He talked about breaking into the business with Buzz Sawyer. Again, this is where he talks a lot about Buzz Sawyer, and then he shares some stories about him, which was cool. He said he learned a lot about the business while he was in Memphis. He actually teamed with Papa Shango at one point, the Godfather, because they had nothing for him, so they just kind of paired the two of them together, which was kind of funny. Austin recalls working with Undertaker in the horrible match they had. I don't know if it was in WCW or somewhere else, but they had this really bad match. And Taker remembers being in that exact same spot that Austin was in when he first showed up in Memphis all those years ago. They also tell a story about how Stone Cold told Taker over the phone that he was going to stretch him the next time they were in the ring together, which was kind of like, not like a threat, but it was like, I'm going to beat the shit out of you the next time I see you in the ring. I guess because Austin asked Taker for a ride. Again, I kind of get my stories crossed here, but I think the general premise of the story was that Austin asked Taker for a ride. Taker said no, because they were, I think one was a heel, one was a babyface, and you can't really ride with someone that's of the opposite character dynamic. So he said no, and Austin got hot. He got pissed. So he told Taker that he was going to basically beat the shit out of him next time he saw him in the ring. And then Taker was like, oh my God, did he just say that to me over the phone? And all this other stuff. And I think Austin was, a lot earlier on in his career than Taker was. So Taker was kind of taken aback by what he just said. Dutch Mantel, a.k.a. Zeb Coulter, was eating this shit up. He fucking loved all of this because he heard the entire conversation. He was eating all this shit up. He loved it. So Taker talks a stint. He talks about his stint in WCW and how he was brought in as kind of like a monster, because the guy's huge, to replace Sid Vicious when I think he left probably for WWE in 90, 91, I don't remember. He talks about a story where Dan Spivey actually was a good friend of his, I guess, and helped them ensure that the Road Warriors were not going to test him. Like, the whole breaking into the business thing and kind of beating respect into people, and I don't know what the exact word, hazing and stuff like that, in order to kind of groom people to be ready for the company or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like, they would do that with a lot of talent back in the day, especially back then. And Dan Spivey kind of helped them avoid that, which was cool. However, despite being kind of accustomed to the way that the way that WCW was doing things back then, Ole Anderson told Taker, listen, dude, no one, and I mean no one, would pay to see you wrestle. And Taker really took that personally, as he should have. I mean, obviously, it's a pretty big dig. It's a pretty bad thing to say to someone. It really hit his pride. It really hurt his pride to hear from this legend that no one would pay to see him wrestle. And that WCW, in so many words, had no plans for him. So Paul Heyman and Taker were really close back then. Paul Heyman, I guess. I honestly never knew this. And this is probably common knowledge. I never knew this, though. That Paul Heyman managed The Undertaker back in his early days in WCW, which I never knew. So he basically relayed the message to Taker that WCW had nothing for him. So I guess he kind of brokered a deal of sorts to kind of get him into WWE. So one night he went to the China Club, which I guess is an infamous place. Never heard of it before personally. It's some sort of a club in New York. And there's like 1 million people in there. But before he went to the China Club, the next day he was going to meet Vince at his house. And he was staying at Paul Heyman's house with his mom, or Paul Heyman's mom's house, or whatever. It was a weird story. That night after they went to New York at the China Club. But before they went out, he bought clothes. He got to dress nice to meet fucking Vince McMahon, the head of WWF. So he went out, bought these nice clothes, wore them to China Club. He ripped his pants, literally as soon as he got in Paul Heyman's car. And he's like, fuck, what am I going to do? And Paul Heyman says, oh, when we get to the China Club. Like, that's a terrible Paul Heyman impersonation. I'm not even sure what the hell that is, actually. It's more like John Laurinaitis. But he tells Taker, listen, when we get to the China Club, we'll help sew up your pants. There's 1 million people there. Someone can sew up your pants, blah, blah, blah. No one does. There's 1 million people there. They don't give a shit about sewing pants. No one helps Taker. So they get back at like 4 a.m. at Paul Heyman's mom's house, or Paul Heyman's house where his mom was staying. I'm not exactly sure whose house it was, but Paul Heyman's mom's stuff was there. So Taker's kind of going through Paul Heyman's mom's sewing kit, which is just a hilarious visual back in 1990, 1991. Or no, it would have been 1990 or early or late. No, it would have been probably 89, I would think, because he debuted at Survivor Series 90, and this was before Mania. Because he talked about how Vince didn't have any plans for him and that, maybe they would bring him in maybe after WrestleMania. So it must have been, it probably must have been late 89, mid 90, if we're being exact here. I'm not exactly, I forgot what point exactly in his career this was, but it was one of the two, either late 89 or mid 1990. So anyway, he rips his pants, and with the power of Paul Heyman's mom's sewing kit, he kind of like does it himself, sews up the pants to the best of his ability, and then he goes to Vince's house the next day. So he told Vince, when Vince asks him, oh, what are your talents? Like, oh, what are your talents, pal? That would be a Vince impersonation. Taker tells him, oh, I could sing in the shower, kind of like to break the ice, to be funny. As soon as he said that, he realized it was a dumb thing to say. Because he realized that back then in the early 90s, that their gimmicks were fucking atrocious. Like, this was pre-Duke the Dumpster Droese and Mantor and shit like that, but it was still pretty bad gimmick-wise back then. So as soon as he said that, he realized he shouldn't have, because he knew he'd be brought in as this fucking singing in the shower man. Like, that would be his gimmick, and he knew he'd be doomed from the start if that was the case. It never really amounted to anything. Vince thought it was fascinating, but never really led anywhere. After that, Vince told him, listen, dude, we don't have anything for you. I'm sorry, like, you're a great guy, great wrestler, whatever. We don't have anything for you at this current point. Maybe we'll bring you in after WrestleMania, no guarantees. And Taker was like, shit, well, I wasn't expecting that, because at that point, he'd already given his notice to WCW, so he's kind of fucked. Already told WCW that he was done, banking on getting a job with WWE, and Vince told him flat out, we have no plans for you right now. So he was like, shit, what am I going to do? So at this point in the interview, they break out the whiskey, and they start drinking whiskey. I'm surprised it wasn't one of Stone Cold's Broken Skull IPAs, but whiskey's a nice choice. I'm not a drinking man, but I would assume that's a nice choice for this type of conversation. So Taker was watching the WWF before he ended up getting the call from Vince to come on in. He was keeping up with the product, and he was watching the vignettes for what was in the egg that would be debuting at Survivor Series. So before Vince even ever called him, he thought he would be brought in as the Eggman, and he's like, holy shit, like, that'd be a career killer. I hope to God that's not the case. So Vince ends up calling him, and he calls him and says, is this the Undertaker? And Taker's sitting there like, okay, like, is this Vince? Is it not Vince? He didn't think it was actually Vince at first, okay? But then he's like, Taker, Undertaker, okay, like, that sounds like a decent gimmick. Doesn't sound like Eggman to me, all right. Then he goes, yeah, this is the Undertaker, and they have a conversation about what the Undertaker gimmick would look like, and that's how it started, which was fascinating, because I never knew that. But yeah, he's like, I didn't know what an Undertaker was, but it sounded a whole lot cooler. It sounded a whole lot cooler than whatever the hell Eggman would be. So he ran with it. Taker, at this point in the interview, I never really thought about this, and I thought this was really interesting, that he talks about here how he had to slow himself down in the gimmick, and how the gimmick really limited what he could do in the ring. And Taker was a really good wrestler. For a big man, he could go. In WCW and other promotions, he could really go. But because of the gimmick, it wouldn't really allow him to work, at the rate that he wanted to. And Stone Cold brought up how kids were legit scared watching him debut because the character was so cool. And Taker liked the look, and it took him a while to really put the entire thing together, but he constantly had to live the gimmick. He said that he never put himself in a position, he never put himself in a situation where he had to be anything but the Undertaker. He never really, even if he went out in public, he was wearing Taker-like clothes. His entire closet back then was all black clothes because he had to be the dead man day in and day out. And I'm sure that was a Taker call more than it was a Vince call, but that was the nature of the character back then. He also talked about when, Steve brought up how he worked his debut match with, not Papa Shango, what's his name? The fucking bird guy. Coco Beware, when he spiked him with the tombstone. He didn't really talk about that so much as he did the fact that he was working with Dusty Rhodes back then. And Taker even admitted that he had to stop himself from marking out from working with Dusty Rhodes because it was such an honor for him. And he said that the other people, interestingly enough, in the match that he debuted in at Survivor Series, were kind of pissed about Taker. Were kind of pissed with Taker because they were kind of pissed at him because he was taking all these moves and just no-selling it. Taker was no-selling everything they threw at him, so they were kind of pissed, and this was back at a time where that was kind of disrespectful to do that type of shit, but that was the nature of the character. And Steve even said, like, these dudes got to realize that it was your time to shine, like, they can't be upset at that. It was your time to get over the character. So Steve asks Taker, who did you go to for advice back then? Taker's go-to guy, none other than Jake the Snake Roberts. Perfect person to go to for advice. He says that Jake really inspired his promo style and talking slow and talking softly so people would really pay attention. And that all came from Jake Roberts, which was really interesting. And he talked about how Jake Roberts was brought in. The guy was a great wrestler. But when he was having great matches when he first started with WWE, Vince was pissed. Vince was pissed that Jake Roberts was having really, really good matches, which sounds ridiculous. But it actually makes sense. For as out of touch as Vince seems to be with the current product, back then, the guy had his, he was on the fucking pulse of everything that was wrestling back then. And he would tell Jake, like, listen, dude, I didn't hire you to have great matches. And Jake was like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm a great wrestler. Why wouldn't I go out there and have a great match? Vince was like, I didn't hire you to have great matches. I hired you to be a great character. Because when you went out there and had that great match with so-and-so, the crowd didn't give a shit. But they gave a shit about you as a character. And that's kind of along the same lines that Taker followed, kind of the same path that his career followed when he was in WWE, because he wasn't hired for his matches. He wasn't hired for his athletic ability. He was hired to play a character. And the character is what the crowd would care more about than if Taker went out there and had a 5-star match. And it really hurt Taker's pride early on to watch guys like Bret Hart have a 5-star match, because he knew that he could go out there and have that type of match, but he had to do more of the character stuff to really get the crowd invested in what he was doing, which I thought was brilliant, because that makes a lot of sense. To the point where he would sell the character so well, people would actually come up to him and ask him if he was really dead. Like, that's amazing. You would never get that today. So he talks about, from there, he transitions into the Attitude Era. He knew that character would never last through the Attitude Era and the nature of what they were doing at that time. The nature of the television show they were producing back then, he knew it would never last. So as a result, he became the American Badass. And it was cool to hear him talk about this, and I'm glad they didn't gloss over it. And I'm sure, I didn't think they would, just because Taker, that was a majority of who Steve worked with, was the American Badass. A little bit with the, the Ministry of Darkness bullshit from like 97, 98. Mostly, though, it was American Badass from 2000 to 2001, 2002, 03. That's who Taker was during that point. And that's really who Austin worked a lot with. I mean, in 98, it was the Dead Man, but in 2001, it was all about the American Badass. So we talked about the transition into American Badass and how it gave him an opportunity to bring back the Dead Man character years later, after the Attitude Era was over, because he knew if he took a break from it, it would mean more if he went back to it years later, which it did, which is, again, brilliant booking, very smart thinking. He was off TV in late 99, I think it was, because he came back in 2000 at Judgment Day, which they showed the footage of, and they both ate that shit up because it was such a cool return. One of the best returns in WWE history. Probably Taker's best return, which does not get enough credit for being as good as it was. But anyway, he was off TV around that point for about 8 or 9 months, he says, with a torn pectoral muscle. So he came back with a different gimmick, and it was really nerve-wracking for him because he didn't know how it would go over. He came back, with the same trench coat, but different hairstyle, different, facial hair, different clothes, different fighting style, different everything. So it was really, really nerve-wracking for him as to whether this would sink or swim, and ultimately it worked. But yeah, he talks about the American Badass, which was really cool. And it was during this time that he had a lot of road stories to share. He talked about partying with Cypress Hill and X-Pac one night, and the infamous story that went along with that, which was pretty funny, and how Taker didn't really, not that he didn't drink, but he didn't do, marijuana and shit like that. He didn't smoke pot. Pac did, I guess. X-Pac did. Cypress Hill did. They were doing all that shit. Taker just kind of sat back and enjoyed himself. He was like the last person still standing at the end of the night, which was really funny. They talk about the iconic picture, which I'm sure you've seen floated around online elsewhere, with him, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, a couple other people, I think. He talked about how it was a really important picture because it was right after that the Monday Night War really started. And now Hall and Nash, that was right before they left for WCW. That was right before they left for the opposition. And he talked about how he was not there for the curtain call, because Steve asks him, like, oh, how pissed were you at the curtain call when it happened with Shawn Michaels and Triple H and Scott Hall and Kevin Nash? And he said, I wasn't even there. But he did talk about WCW beating their ass week after week after week in the Monday Night War. And he said, very interesting line here, because I know a lot of people were wondering, like, oh, did you ever consider a jump to WCW? That's been one of the biggest questions for Taker in all these years that he has not done interviews, that people have always wondered. Did he ever come close to jumping ship to WCW? And again, maybe he's bullshitting, but I tend to take him at his word here because he sounded very believable. He said that he would have stuck with Vince even if the WWF ship sank like the fucking Titanic. He would have gone down with the ship. He would have gone down with Vince McMahon at the helm because of what Ole said to him all those years earlier about how no one would pay to see him wrestle. That really stuck with him, and he never forgot it. So as a result of that, not only would he have never gone over to WCW, regardless of what the money situation was like, regardless of what the creative was like, regardless of what was going on at that time, business-wise, financially, whatever. Taker didn't really say that he never considered a run, returning to WCW, but he basically did say, listen, no matter what happened, whether we were successful or failing, whatever, even if the company went out of business, I would have not gone over to WCW because of what Ole said to me all those years earlier, which to me blew my mind. He really is the equivalent to what Sting was in WCW, because Sting never ended up coming over for 13 years. WCW closed in 2001. Sting did not come over to WWE until 2014, until 5 years ago this past weekend. I think Taker would have been in a very similar spot. In some alternate universe, when WWF went out of business, I really don't think Taker would have gone to WCW. I tend to believe him there. He probably, maybe years later, if WCW is what WWE is today, maybe he would have, entertained the idea of having a run there years later, but initially, absolutely not, because of what Ole Anderson said to him years earlier. That's fascinating to me. I thought that was really interesting. But anyway, speaking of Vince and being on that same subject, he talks about the relationship that he has with Vince and how they've always really had a really good creative relationship. And how obviously it was Vince's vision to come up with the Dead Man character and the Undertaker, all this other shit. But he really gave Taker a lot of slack to work with it and make it his own, which he did. So it really goes both ways. He talks about how Big Evil in like 02, 03, 04 was a hybrid of both Dead Man and American Badass. And that was when he had his best matches. Now, he wasn't Big Evil when he was having the matches with Shawn and with Triple H fucking in 09, 2010, 2011, 2012. That was like a decade later. But still, it was years on. His whole point here is that it wasn't early on when he first came into the company that he was having his best matches. Rather, it was in the twilight of his career that he's been having the best matches. Not recently, but back in 09, 2010, 2011, 2012, absolutely hands down the best matches in the career of The Undertaker. And he's had a lot of good ones. He's had a lot of great ones. But his best ones, I would argue, were absolutely, I agree, from that period, from 09 through 2012. He looks at the Shawn Michaels Triple H program as a 4-year program. He looks at those matches at WrestleManias 25, 26, 27, and 28 as a 4-year feud, which it absolutely was, because the story continued even after Shawn retired at WrestleMania 26, which it did, because Shawn was always involved. Even going into WrestleMania 27, where Shawn Michaels, he was on the show, he got inducted into the Hall of Fame that night. He wasn't involved in the match itself, but he was involved in the build. He was on that go-home show before Mania 27, involved with Undertaker and Triple H. So he absolutely was involved, heavily involved, in the build to that match at WrestleMania. He also talks about how, and this is very interesting, the matches with Shawn Michaels were more like of a wrestling match, whereas the matches with Triple H later on were more physical. Because he knew for a fact that regardless of what him and Triple H did at WrestleManias 27 and 28, he knew that it was not going to top what he and Shawn did. So they had to come up with a different type of match. Their 27 match, I think, was no holds barred. The 28 match was Hell in the Cell. Both matches were terrific. I like the 28 match a lot more than I did the 27 match, but both matches are awesome. So I thought that was interesting that he actually flat out said that, yeah, the Triple H matches, we had to make them different than the Shawn matches because they would never live up to the greatness that those matches were, which is true. He talks about how all 4 matches at WrestleMania were very story-based. And if you didn't walk away from that WrestleMania 28 match, hooked on the story they were telling in that match, then you're probably not a real wrestling fan. Again, it wasn't an instant classic in terms of in-ring action, but I fucking 100% agree. In the ring, from an in-ring standpoint, is it a 5-star classic? No. But from a story standpoint, people were hooked on every near fall in that Hell in the Cell match. It was an amazing story told. Completely agree with him there. He actually said when Steve brought up the picture of him and Shawn and Triple H at the top of the stage, one of the most famous pictures probably in the history of this entire company, when they're all looking out into the audience and before they walk to the back, he said it was an organic moment. That wasn't a WWE thing like, oh, stand on the stage and look out in the audience. No, that was just something they came up with on the spot, and that was all organic, which is cool. He said in that moment, Steve goes, "What are you thinking of this moment, Taker? What are you thinking of this moment looking at that picture? Like, what was going through your mind in that moment?" Taker goes, "I didn't even know I was coming back." He didn't know in that moment whether he was coming back for the next WrestleMania, regardless of whether he was coming back at all. He thought that was it. And honestly, and I've said this a million times, I don't care what anyone says, Undertaker should have absolutely retired at WrestleMania 28. And yeah, he had a great send-off 5 years later at 33. I was there for that one. I agree. That also would have been a great way to go off and ride off into the sunset. But had he retired in 2012 at WrestleMania 28, which was absolutely the best match of the last 10 years that he's had in WWE, aside from the Shawn ones, that would have been the perfect send-off because he was 20-0. The streak would not have been broken. The Punk match was great too, WrestleMania 29, but that was the truly last great match that he had. Maybe the Brock match at Hell in a Cell 2015 was also pretty damn good. Other than that, though, that was the last really great match, and I completely agree with anyone who has ever said that Taker should have retired at WrestleMania 28. That should have been it. Don't tell people it's the last match. Just ride off into the sunset and never come back. That would have been perfect. That would have been the real end of an era. Instead of what they ended up doing years later, which was bullshit with Triple H coming back and Taker coming back and even Shawn coming back at Crown Jewel last year, which, Taker never brings up, which I'll get to I'll get to that momentarily. But anyway, he said he was really proud of that finish. He was really proud of that string of matches he had with Shawn Michaels and Triple H. And Steve asks him, what's kind of going through your mind after you have such an amazing match like that? And Taker says, after the adrenaline wears off, all that pain comes back. And the reality really starts to set in about an hour afterward. Like, shit, my body is in fucking shambles right now. It's going to take weeks for me to bounce back from this. But in the moment, though, he's like, wow, like it's this real adrenaline of being in the moment and realizing he had such a great match. He said he doesn't put over his own shit, he says, but he does say that those matches were amazing, which, again, I agree with. He says now, because Steve brings up, so what is it about for you now? Clearly, he doesn't say money, which I'm sure is a factor, but he does say it's all about the personal challenges. And he even said he does Vince a lot of favors. And he knows that window is shrinking for when, he can really wrap it up and be done and whatever. He knows he does not have much time left. He knows he's closer to the end of his career than he is the beginning. Obviously, the guy's 30 years in. He's not going to wrestle for the next 30 years. The guy would be 80, could you imagine? Dear Lord. He's going to die in the ring one of these days if he keeps it up, let alone at 80. But anyway, the biggest thing for him, and I'm really glad he said this, because he said this in an interview. Again, I forgot with who. It was a really, really memorable interview that he did. Again, I mentioned it earlier. I don't think it was with Colin Cowherd. It was someone like that in 0102. I forgot the guy's name, but you would know it if you saw the interview. He says in the interview here and there that he doesn't want to become a parody of himself. That's the most important thing to him. He said it then, and he said it almost over 20 years later, even now. And the thing is now, is that a lot of people would argue that he indeed has become a parody of what he once was. And he struggles with that even to this day. He said he doesn't want to overstay his welcome. He doesn't want to stay too long. And he really thought that WrestleMania 33 was the end. After he lost to Roman, the match sucked. But he lost to Roman. He left all of his shit in the ring. And that was it. And he said that what he did on that night was worth more than any speech he could ever do. Because he knows that his character isn't really all about giving speeches and riding off. He's more about riding off into the sunset. The way that he did at WrestleMania 33 than he is coming out on Raw like Shawn Michaels did when he retired, or even Ric Flair when he retired and they gave him the whole 9 yards and had people come back and cry in the flowers, and it was a really emotional moment, but that's not who Undertaker is. So what he did at WrestleMania 33 could have and should have would have been the end. Instead, he got talked into coming back by Vince. And he says that he can't turn back. Once he starts training for a comeback, he can't turn back. That's it. He's back into it. So again, he never brings up how he got talked back into it, by Vince. Maybe he did and they cut it out, I don't know. There's a lot of things that he says in this interview that I really wish he went more in depth with. A lot of stuff I would love to learn more about, because he kind of glosses over a lot of shit. He's like, oh, I got talked back into coming back. How, though? Like, was it the John Cena thing? Was it a money thing? Was it a favor for Vince? Like, hey, pal, we got a great idea for you to come back. Like, what is it? I would really love to know the nature of that conversation. I would love to hear that conversation recorded between Vince and Taker on the phone about him coming back for a comeback. Whenever that might have been, whether it was in the summer of 2018 or 2017 rather, or early on in 2018. I would love to know what that conversation looked like. So they talk about the WrestleMania 30 match with Brock. He doesn't mention the match sucks. It did. He was concussed in the first 5 minutes of the match. And I saw a lot of people tweeting afterward like, oh my God, he was concussed. Taker just said it himself. Well, no shit. First of all, it was obvious that the guy was completely out of it. And second of all, we knew this the night of the show. People reported it 5.5 years ago that Taker was concussed in the first 5 minutes of the match. And yeah, again, that's probably partially why the match sucked. It was going to be terrible anyway. The formula that they were working with that match just fucking sucked. It was a bad match. It was not a good match. Concussion or no concussion, obviously that plays a factor, of course. But even putting that aside, it was not a good match. Taker says, when Steve asks him how that night went and everything, he doesn't ask him, and this is what kind of disappointed me, because, Steve's obviously a really good friend of Taker, but even as his friend, he should have said, like, listen, dude, did you agree with the streak ending? And maybe Taker answers this by saying what he said next. He goes, dude, I don't even remember that day. I don't even remember the night. He said that he's watched the match back since about 10 to 15 times. He can't remember where he got hurt. It was probably one of the suplexes, he said, but he can't remember where the concussion happened. He said his last memory of that day is around 3:30 in the afternoon when he had a conversation with his wife, probably about the streak ending if I had to take a guess. Other than that, though, his next memory after that is of 5 a.m. the next day with the doctors, and he can't answer their questions. He doesn't know what his name is. He doesn't know where he is. And the only thing that he can remember is his wife's first name. And he tried to ask her, like, hey, can you tell me where we are so I can answer their questions? And she's like, hell no, I'm not bailing you out of this. Like, this is really important, which was really funny that he said that. But it's true. Like, you can't bail him out. This is really important that he doesn't know where he is. That's crazy. He had no idea where the fuck he was. So again, he can't pick out where exactly it happened in the match. It was probably on a suplex that he took from Brock. But he doesn't blame Brock. Because Brock didn't know that he was concussed. He didn't know that he was hurt, which is hard to imagine that Taker didn't say something to the ref to say to Brock, but whatever. He said that match really screwed up his confidence, though, and that the body, his body probably wasn't ready for the trauma he was ready to take in that match. The trauma that he was set to take in the match, his body probably just wasn't ready for it, which is why he got concussed. He wasn't wrestling a hell of a whole lot back then. I think his last match before that one was probably in the spring of 2013. So that's probably why. He wasn't physical. He wasn't doing anything physical on the road to WrestleMania, or he didn't wrestle any matches at all. It probably played a factor in the fact that he was concussed, because his body just wasn't used to taking that type of abuse at that point. So yeah, he didn't want to retire. When Taker gets asked by Steve, when Steve asks him, why did you not retire after that match? And it bothered Taker a lot, and he says, I didn't want to retire without remembering my last match, which is such a great point. And I don't think a lot of people were saying, oh, you should have retired after the streak got broken or whatever. I think some people were saying that, but I think by and large, a lot of people agree that he should have absolutely retired either after WrestleMania 28 in 2012 or after WrestleMania 33 in 2017. After WrestleMania 30, I was thinking the same thing, that he had to come back to kind of redeem himself, because that match sucked. That WrestleMania 30 match sucked. So I kind of figured that he would have to come back to kind of make up for that. But he makes a great point that he really wanted to remember his last match. The guy's been in the business 30 years. Imagine not knowing what your last match was, or having a single memory of the day of when it happened. That's crazy, But he said he likes, he kind of looks up to Shawn a lot. And that Shawn Michaels knew after WrestleMania 26 that he was done. He didn't bring up the fact that Shawn ended up coming out of retirement last year, but whatever. He thinks that Austin's retirement, he calls Stone Cold's retirement a blessing in disguise, because Austin never really had the choice, which I kind of disagree. I could see what he's getting at, but I think Edge, if you told him that, he would say, bullshit, I really wish I had the choice of retiring, and he was going to retire anyway. Like, some people don't know if, like, my career is going to end, whatever. You know, he didn't really have a choice either. So I don't really agree with Taker there, but I'm not a wrestler, so I can't really say. But Austin even says that that he got concussed at SummerSlam 1998 in his match with Taker like the first 20 seconds. And it still haunts Steve Austin to this day that he can't remember the match that he had with Taker, and they could have gone out there and had a great match, but he doesn't remember it because he got concussed just by accident. And Taker says, listen, it's just something that happened. Shit happens. It's a very physical industry, and it's the same thing that happened with him and Brock. It's just something that happened. No one is to blame for it. So he also says that you can't think about it. You can't think once you get in that ring. When you think about, am I going to blow my knee out when I get in there? Or am I going to do this? Or am I going to get hurt? Blah, blah, blah. That's when you really screw yourself up. And he cites the Super Showdown match with Goldberg as an example. That he was probably overthinking things, and that's why that's why it was as bad as it was, and Goldberg got concussed, and they were all fucked up, and the match was terrible. It's probably what happened there. So they bring up that match, and he says you can't work with fear. But currently, and he also said he didn't want to go out on that note. They don't really go into much detail about the match itself, and the fact that he kind of had to make himself, kind of redeem himself from that match by coming back a month later. But he didn't want to go out on that note, because the match was terrible. And he was well aware, like, listen, the match sucked. I can't retire with that being my last match. He also said that he's very cognizant of where he is physically now and what his body can take and what it can't. He actually admits that he's told his wife, Michelle McCool, that he wants to retire. Like, I'm going to retire. I'm done. This is it. 15 times. I mean, obviously that's an exaggeration. But the point still stands. He's probably told her X amount of times, hey, I'm done. This is it for me. And she always rolls her eyes because she knows that he's not being serious. She knows that it's bullshit and that he's not actually done. And to this day, he's still not done, so she has every right to roll her eyes at that. She has every right to roll her eyes at her husband. But he also says that he will not stop probably until someone that he respects, like a Triple H or a Shawn Michaels or a Steve Austin or whatever, tells him that it's over. But it also puts them in an awkward position because they don't want to be the ones to tell Taker, like, hey, you should probably be done. I mean, it's kind of like an asshole thing to say a little bit, you know, unless you're really, really close with them. And I mean, obviously they're all close, but still it is kind of a mean thing to say, like, hey, your last match was kind of sort of terrible. I think you should be done. So I could see why Taker would think that would be a weird thing for anyone to just come up and tell him, but I think he should have been done years ago, but I'm not his friend, so I can't really tell him that. But overall, though, he thinks he's really proud of the career he's had in WWE. So Steve Austin, before they wrap it up, he apologizes to Taker for their match at Insurrection 2001, where he almost took off Taker's ear, I guess with his knee brace or something, almost Mick Foley style. Thankfully, nothing really came of it. I guess not Foley's ear, which is gone, but Taker's ear was like fucking jacked up after the match, after Austin rubbed his knee against it by accident on the ropes. I don't exactly know how to describe it, but thankfully he did not lose his ear. And Taker says, listen, dude, you have no reason to apologize to me, but apologize to Kurt Angle instead for X, Y, and Z. And they bring up the story about the plane ride from hell and that all shit from 2002, which was just funny to hear him talk about. And they also bring up, before they wrap it up, about how Austin's goal always was to make Undertaker crack. He always wanted Taker to break character. So they recall a story where they did this like 8-man headlock like chain of people putting someone in a headlock, and then someone else in a headlock, and then someone else in a headlock, and so on and so forth, until there were 8 people doing it. And then like Aldo Montoya, or whatever the hell his name is, I forgot, I was drawing a blank there for a second, but Just Incredible, probably, I think that's who they're talking about here. Instead of being the one to put on the headlock, he just went in the ring and took the headlock, which was kind of funny. But they relive all the times that Taker almost broke character. He almost corpsed in the middle of the ring in segments with JBL, another one backstage. I think it's Survivor Series 01 was when the clip was from. He was backstage with Vince, Steve Austin, Chris Jericho, Kane, and Kurt Angle. And Steve was like repeating everything that Vince was saying backstage. And Taker, he was trying to get Taker to laugh and he couldn't, but he almost cracked a smile. The closest I think Taker ever came to getting Steve, or the closest Taker ever came to smiling during like a segment or something, this was like a dark match segment, But that was, I think, in like 2002, 2001. Probably closer to 2002. This was when Goldberg and Booker T were teaming. And Booker T wanted Taker to do the spin-a-rooney. And he said, absolutely not. He talked into the camera and he's like, listen, Vince, I'm not doing this shit. So you better get your ass out here and do it yourself because I'm not doing it. So Vince comes out. Hilariously enough, he does it too. He does the spin-a-rooney terribly. Awful. It's absolutely terrible. But it is funny to watch, though. Almost gets Vince to crack. Almost gets Taker to crack. And during it went on for an hour, Taker said. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't get the guy to crack. They couldn't get him to do the spin-a-rooney. And then during some sort of segment or brawl during the segment, Taker kind of like power walked off and Vince sent in Big Show to go after him. And he said, listen, dude, you'll probably beat the shit out of me in the end, but you'll have a very hard time of taking me back out to that ring. And Big Show's like, okay, fine, I won't touch you. It was a really, really funny story. And they show the footage. It's just amazing stuff. And then they wrap things up from there, and they close it out, and they ride off into the sunset, do his usual shtick. But yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed this. Again, the hour and 40 minutes really flies by. There's a lot of stuff I really wish they dove into even further, like the Kane stuff. Maybe the invasion. I mean, they kind of touched upon that, but definitely like the streak ending. Again, I know that he wasn't cognizant that night. He wasn't even conscious. After the concussion, he doesn't remember anything from that day, which is really scary. But in retrospect, Steve should have said, all right, looking back on it now 5 years later, do you think the streak should have ended? I'm shocked he did not ask him that question, because from what I recall, Steve was very vocal on his podcast back then about being pissed that the streak was over. Maybe Taker said, dude, I don't want to talk about it, so let's not go into it. I don't know. That was one question I really wanted to hear him talk about, but they didn't get into it. Again, there's a lot of other stuff they could have talked about, like today's product and shit like that. They didn't. But overall, though, this was great. A very fun trip down memory lane. And again, even if it was a podcast with Steve and Taker talking about picking up dog poop for 2 hours, I would have watched it. Because anything with Taker out of character is fascinating. He's one of the few people, if not the only person out there, who never really breaks character, even 30 years later. So it's really fascinating to hear him just speak as a normal person in a setting like this. So this was great. Check it out on the WWE Network, the Broken Skull Sessions debut with the dead man, The Undertaker. So great stuff here. Thank you guys for checking out my review. We are almost, 47 minutes, and holy shit. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get this up before Raw. Probably. I'm going to try. And if not, it should be up on Tuesday. But I'm going to try to get this up before Raw, and if I do, there's a new network and chill tomorrow, because yes, we had new network content go up every fucking day this past weekend. So tomorrow is going to be my review of WWE The Day Of, focusing on Night 1 and 2 of the WWE 2019 Draft. So that's going up tomorrow, and if you haven't already, check out my other reviews of WWE Untold, Sting's Last Stand from 2015. Sting's another guy I would love to see on this show. And again, that's another thing I would have loved to have heard Taker talk about. Like, how badly would you have wanted that match with Sting? How close did you come to having that match, make it happen? Because that's one of the last real dream matches in pro wrestling. It's not going to happen now, of course. I don't know if anyone wants to see that in 2019, 2020. But years ago, how close did you guys come to getting that match and to making it happen? So again, hopefully there's a part 2 in the works. But speaking of Sting, like I said, Sting's Last Stand, that episode of WWE Untold, and my review is up now here on the channel, as well as the WWE Chronicle episode on Cain Velasquez from right after TakeOver on Saturday. So a lot of content right now on the channel. No better time than now to subscribe to the channel and get notifications. Hit that little bell button to get notifications and when all this shit is uploaded. Until next time, guys, I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.